Part 19. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 181. This time, the leader of the Wuji sect knelt for a long time, until he could no longer feel the presence of the third prince, and then turned around and left. At this time, the leader of Wuji sect suddenly realized that his entire back was wet with cold sweat. It wasn't until the leader of the Wuji sect could no longer feel the third prince's aura that he slowly came back to his senses, but his legs were already weak at this time. The leader of Wuji sect took a deep breath and calmed down his mood slightly. At this time, he looked into the distance with burning eyes. The third prince uses such methods, but the result is like this in the end. Judging from my current situation, I am definitely no match for the third prince. So what should I do? At this moment, a man in black robes walked away slowly. After the man in black robes came in, the leader of the Wuji sect turned his head and looked at him, with a panicked look on his face. He was heavy-handed, with some indescribable fear in his eyes. At this time, even his voice and tone changed a little. Why is it you? At this time, the man slowly walked up to the leader of the Wuji sect, with a few meaningful smiles on the corners of his mouth, and his eyes were staring straight at the leader of the Wuji sect, with a cold feeling on his body. The killing intent was quietly released. Then come and tell me, why can't it be me? The leader of Wuji sect took a deep breath and calmed down his mood slightly. At this time, his eyes narrowed to a slit, and a bit of panic flashed in his eyes. Aren't you supposed to be dead? How could you still be alive when the third prince did it himself? The man in the black robe slowly untied his cloak. At this moment, he was covered in wounds. These wounds were as deep as the bones, which looked shocking. There was a bit of sneer on the corner of the black-robed man's mouth, and a bit of coldness flashed in his eyes. The gauze clothes on his body were looming, and a violent momentum emanated from his body, suppressing on the body of the leader of Wuji sect. At this time, the leader of Wuji sect felt that he was out of breath. Why do you do this? Why do you do this to me? The leader of the Wuji sect was already a bit hysterical. At this time, the man stretched out his hand and gently picked up the teacup on the table. He took a sip of the tea, and then he couldn't help but shake his head. The best Taiguanyan needs a drop of the blood of a powerful person in the divine realm when frying it. Legend has it that there are very few of them in the world. I didn't expect that I could drink it here this time. I was quite surprised. Not as good as that. The leader of the Wuji sect spent a lot of money to finally get 1 or 2. Even these 1 or 2 rounds still consumed a copy of his heaven-level skills. Originally it was just to please the third prince, but he didn't want the third prince to leave without even drinking or smelling it. At this time, the leader of the Wuji sect seemed to have remembered something, and he turned his head. Come, stare at the guy in front of you, with a bit of coldness flashing in your eyes. What I didn't expect is that you dare to come out now. Aren't you afraid that the third prince will kill you? When the man heard what the leader of the Wuji sect said, he was slightly stunned at first, but after a moment, a sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth. He slowly turned his head and faced the leader of the Wuji section. Taking a look here, the murderous intention on his body was looming, if not there. At this time, the leader of the Wuji sect felt as if he had fallen into an ice cave. He subconsciously took a few steps back, with a hint of panic in his eyes. What do you want to do? I'm warning you, you'd better not mess around, otherwise, what would happen? Have you forgotten what you did to me back then? Is it possible that you really don't even remember what you did to me back then? The man deliberately lowered his voice. At this time, the leader of the Wuji sect stepped back one after another. The panic and fear in his eyes were naturally self-evident. The leader of the Wuji sect swallowed a mouthful of saliva, and then waved his hands crazily one after another. Believe me, this matter really has nothing to do with me. I swear to God, This matter really has nothing to do with me. After the man in black robe heard what the leader of the Wajji sect said, a smile suddenly appeared on the corner of his mouth. He gently patted the leader of the Wajji sect on the shoulder. There was quite a bit of joking in his eyes. Really, doesn't it have anything to do with it? Do you think I will believe you? At this time, the leader of the Wajji sect had a bit of helplessness in his eyes, and his eyes suddenly dimmed. No. At this time, the man in black robe suddenly smiled. He just smiled and waved his hands, and then the murderous intention on his body suddenly appeared in the next second. Do you think I'm an idiot? That cold murderous intent made the surrounding temperature drop several degrees. At this time, the face of the leader of the Wajji sect suddenly became ugly. There was also a wry smile on the corner of his mouth, and his eyes were full of sadness. Why don't you believe me? Then you come and tell me why I should believe you. The two people confronted each other, not giving in. And just after this moment, the black-robed man suddenly laughed. He laughed very happily, as if he had encountered the funniest thing in the world. The leader of Wajji sect subconsciously took a few steps back, with an inexplicable fear in his eyes, and a bit of sadness in his heart. In fact, I didn't want to do this to your elder brother at the beginning, but the third prince found me and said that you are a supporter of the prince, so he wanted to get rid of you. Otherwise, he would destroy our Wajji section for so many years. I dreamed of you every rainy night. Maybe this is my guilt towards you. The black-robed man had a bit of sadness in his eyes, and then he shook his head, and a bitter smile appeared at the corner of his mouth, and his eyes were full of helplessness. I don't blame you for what happened back then, but you never thought of leaving me a backup plan. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 182. The sadness between the black-robed man's eyebrows cannot be faked, and the eyes of the leader of the Wajji sect are also quite complicated. But at this time, the man in black robe suddenly smiled. He turned his head and glanced at the leader of Wajji sect, with a bit of teasing in his eyes. Actually, you don't have to be like this. What can I say? I'm not here to kill you this time, so you don't need to be so panicked. At this time, after the man in black robe heard what the leader of Wajji sect said, he turned his head and glanced in his direction, with a somewhat complicated look in his eyes, and a kind of confusion between his eyebrows. Meaning? I don't quite understand something. This is not important, you just need to understand one thing. What happened? The way of heaven goes around, and the karma you have done in the past will eventually come back to you one day. As long as you get to that time, don't regret it. The man in black robe just said this unhurriedly, and at this time, the leader of Wajji sect also had a thoughtful look on his face, and then he nodded lightly. I do understand what senior brother said, but it's a pity that sometimes after all. The leader of the Wajji sect paused immediately after saying this, and the sadness in his eyes was naturally self-evident. At this time, the man in black robe slowly stood up and walked out. I'm here this time to get back everything you owed me. Today is probably the last time for the two of us to have a drink and talk. We will never be friends again. I can choose to forget what happened back then, but I can't forgive. After the man in black robe finished speaking, he suddenly walked out. At this time, the leader of the Wajji sect stared straight at the back of the man in black robe. There was also a wry smile on the corner of his mouth, and there was a smile between his eyebrows. The look of sadness could not be concealed at all. Why bother? If you want the position of sect leader, what's the harm if I give it to you? The man in black robe just waved his hand, with a sneer at the corner of his mouth. No need. You know, I don't like taking things from other people's hands. I like to snatch things from other people's hands past something. After the man in black robe finished speaking, he turned around and left. At this time, the leader of the Waji sect seemed to have lost his soul. After standing there for a long time, he slowly withdrew his gaze, and then sighed heavily. Alas, there is no solution for this, so what solution for this? Ha ha ha. The leader of Waji sect felt sad for a while. And just after this moment, a figure suddenly rushed outside. This person was the leader of the Waji section. He seemed to be completely crazy, and drew an afterimage in the air. For a moment, a person stood on the heavenly court, looking up at the sky and down at the ground. The mysterious power made people feel a bit of coldness in this person. In the misty forest, Lin Yu made a secret with both hands. At this time when the divine body was first formed, if it was invaded and interfered by external forces, it would probably be destroyed in an instant. At this time, Lin Yu let out a low roar in his mouth, and several flashes flashed in his eyes. Pointed firmly. Give it to me. That mysterious power was revealed from Lin Yu's body. At this time, the murderous intention in Lin Yu's body began to become more and more obvious. Of course he could feel the aura coming from all directions, and of course he knew that these people didn't mean well, but so what? For him now, he has no choice. At that time, several figures rushed over from different directions. Amitabha, I didn't expect that the person coming was you. This is really something I didn't expect. Situ Ningbing just turned her head and glanced at Master Jing Ai. There was a bit of contempt in her eyes, and a sneer appeared at the corner of her mouth. Stop pretending to be mysterious with me here. I don't have time to play with you like this. Master Jing Ai was slightly startled when he heard what Situ Ningbing said, but he smiled after a moment. I'm not blocking your way. It's not up to you to decide how you want to go. When Situ Ningbing heard what Master Jing Ai said, a bit of coldness flashed in his eyes, and the murderous intention in his body was unreservedly displayed. You did not block my way, but I'm afraid some people have evil intentions and will make trouble secretly, which is really disgusting. Master Jing Ai just put his hands together and performed a Buddhist salute. What the donor said may be true, but I, a Buddhist disciple, always pay attention to truth, goodness, and beauty, and it is absolutely impossible for me to do such a thing. Situ Ningbing was just cold, snorted and turned around to leave. At this moment, Lin Yu seemed to suddenly remember something. He turned his head and glanced behind him. There was a bit of complexity in his eyes, and there was something between his eyebrows. Very helpless. Just a moment later, a figure suddenly flew over from a distance, and with the appearance of that small point of light, the second and third followed. When Lin Yu saw these figures flying from a distance, his eyes flashed with a bit of disbelief, and then his brows twisted together, and he sighed heavily. How is it possible? How could there be so many people? In the void, a man holding a folding fan, gently shaking the folding fan in his hand, with a bit of playfulness in his eyes, the man stared at Lin Yu with a bit of provocation in his eyes. Interesting, I didn't expect that this dragon guarding the master would actually dare to come and rob the majesty of the royal family. This is really unexpected, and it really makes me angry. The man's tone became colder and colder at the end, his eyes were full of a kind of ferocity, and the murderous intent on his body was even more faintly revealed. In just one breath, a person rushed up, and that person's speed was incredibly fast, and he arrived in front of the third prince in an instant. Amitabha. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 183. After the third prince heard the voice of Master Jing Ai, a bit of coldness flashed in his eyes, and the murderous intention in his body was suddenly revealed, and his eyes were quite gloomy. I didn't expect you to come to join in the fun, but this time these things probably have nothing to do with you. This time, whoever wants to take advantage of these golden dragons will be the enemy of our royal family. Then don't blame me for being rude. The third prince said coldly, and the murderous intention in his body seemed to have solidified. Master Situ Ningbing Jing I, the two looked at each other and just smiled. In fact, under certain circumstances, Tianfo sect and Tianshan are generally very united, but sometimes they become less united. The third prince's eyes narrowed to a slit. He looked at the two people in front of him, with a bit of gloomy murderous intent flashing in his eyes. It seems like you are a little unconvinced. Master Jing I and Situ Ningbing just shook their heads and smiled. No, how can we be unconvinced? Look at what you said, it's just a joke. The third prince took a deep breath and calmed down his mood a little. In just this moment, the third prince suddenly took action and stormed towards Lin Yu. Bai Shui just drew his sword and wanted to fight, but the old beggar just took a step forward. He turned his head and glanced at Bai Shui, then shook his head and smiled. Why is this happening? Why is it happening like this? At this time, after Bai Shui heard what the old beggar said, there was obvious worry in her eyes. She turned her head and glanced at the old beggar. Old senior, you really can. The old beggar smiled, and then waved his hand gently. Of course there is no problem. Although I am just an old man, these young people still have to sell me some thin noodles. When Bai Shui heard the old beggar say this, a special color flashed in his eyes, and then he nodded gently. And just after this moment, in just this breath, a figure came so quietly. This person was the third prince. When the third prince saw the old beggar, a bit of coldness flashed in his eyes, and the murderous intention in his body quietly emerged. Old senior, my father was very grateful to you back then, but even so, I don't think you should rely on this gratitude to you to rely on your old age. What the third prince said was not polite. After the old beggar heard what the third prince said, he just waved casually, with some meaningful colors flashing in his eyes, and a faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. I don't remember what happened back then, but I still want to show you something. After the old beggar finished speaking, he took out a thumb-sized seal directly from his pocket. This seal was a private seal, but even so, it still exuded a majestic smell that could not be rejected. After the third prince saw this scene, his pupils suddenly enlarged, and a bit of disbelief flashed in his eyes. At this time, the third prince also took a deep breath, and then calmed down his mood slightly. His eyes were fixed on the old beggar, and his eyebrows were quite gloomy. Tell me, what do you want to do? At this time, the old beggar suddenly laughed. He turned his head and stared directly at the third prince, with a bit of teasing in his eyes. Third prince, you might as well come and take a guess. At this time, the third prince suddenly took a step forward. My royal family is bound to win this person, and we will never give him up no matter what, so I'm afraid I'm going to offend him this time. At this time, the third prince's eyes flashed with determination, and then he walked forward. At this moment, the murderous intention in the old beggar quietly emerged. He suddenly took a step forward, and then his eyes were fixed on the third prince. Then he shook his head slightly. Absolutely not, how could the third prince do such a stupid thing? At this time, the third prince gritted his teeth and clenched his fists. Are you saying I'm confused? Do you know that this dragon spirit can only be owned by my royal family? If it has 3 claws and 4 claws, that's it? Just now I saw one with 10 claws. The highest of the royal family only has 9 claws. This guy, how can you be so virtuous? The old beggar just shook his head and sighed quietly. Well, I don't know what his virtues and abilities are, but I do know one thing very well. After the third prince heard what the old beggar said, he turned his head and glanced at the old beggar, with a bit of complexity flashing in his eyes. What do you know? With your power, or even with the power of your entire royal family, I am afraid that you may not be able to truly kill this little guy. If you are stubborn, then I am afraid that you will only be able to draw water from a bamboo basket, and it will be in vain." The old beggar's eyes were staring at the third prince, and the third prince was stunned when he heard what the old beggar said. Just a moment later, the third prince seemed to remember something, and he turned his head and looked at the old beggar. "It seems something is wrong." The old beggar suddenly laughed at this time. "Then you tell me what's wrong." The third prince's eyes narrowed into a slit. "Everything is wrong." The old beggar instantly understood what the third prince meant, and then threw the seal to the third prince. There are indeed a few old guys watching behind the scenes, so you don't need to be the first bird to come out. You have great ambitions, but don't you find that your brother has not come out yet? A word awakened the dreamer, and this is absolutely true. The third prince understood instantly. He clenched the silk-free cloth, then stepped back and gently spread out his folding fan. Even though he was so handsome, his face was gentle and elegant. "Thank you for your advice, Senior. I will take my leave first." Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 184. The old beggar watched the third prince retreat slowly, and then nodded with satisfaction. At this time, the old beggar also had a faint smile on his lips. A bit of complexity flashed in his eyes. The third prince indeed understood this truth and understood that the old beggar told him the purpose of this matter, so at this time he simply retreated. At this time, the old beggar's eyes were staring straight at the back of the third prince. There was a bit of complexity in his eyes, and there was also a faint smile on the corner of his mouth. Although he is quite arrogant, there is also a bit of submissiveness in this arrogance. In this way, it is barely enough and can be considered justified. After the old beggar said this, he also smiled and shook his head. At this time, he subconsciously glanced at Lin Yu. His eyes were quite solemn, and a faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth, and then he sighed heavily. "Take a breath. Hey, you little guy doesn't know how long you can hold on. Anyway, the old beggar's body is about to give out. If you continue like this, I'm afraid you haven't even been born yet. The old beggar will leave before you do." After the old beggar said this, a wry smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, and a bit of helplessness appeared in his eyes, with a look of helplessness all over the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. And at this moment, Lin Yu, among the wind, rain, thunder, and lightning, and the four divine dragons, only the lightning dragon has been hovering in this time and space, never falling for a long time. And just a moment later, the 5 giant dragons of metal, wood, water, and fire suddenly entered Lin Yu's body at the same time. When Lin Yu felt this powerful force at this moment, he felt as if he was about to be forcibly exploded by this force. And just a moment later, Lin Yu seemed to suddenly remember something, and silently recited the innate chaos method in his mouth. He had just discovered the set of magic formulas from his own sea of consciousness, so at this time he just started to recite it silently. At this time, Lin Yu finished reciting this spell silently, and then suddenly opened his eyes. At this time, he seemed to suddenly remember something. At this time, his eyes evoked some meaningful brilliance, and then he raised his eyebrows slightly, and the murderous intention appeared like this vaguely. A teasing smile appeared at the corner of Lin Yu's mouth, and a bit of amusement seemed to flash in his eyes. At this time, he slowly opened his eyes, and there seemed to be something in his eyes on the left. The eyes have 5 kinds of brilliance, and the right eye has 3 kinds of brilliance. There seems to be a bit of sadness in this brilliance. And just after this moment, Lin Yu suddenly raised his head, looked up into the void, and looked directly into the eyes of the giant dragon. He also stared at Lin Yu for a moment. After that, he suddenly rushed towards Lin Yu's body. In just such a breath, the giant dragon suddenly penetrated Lin Yu's body. At this time, Lin Yu only felt a surge of energy. After waiting for this moment, a mouthful of blood suddenly spurted out from his mouth. At this time, his eyes were full of disbelief. And just a moment later, Lin Yu suddenly seemed to remember something. No, something is wrong. He slowly raised his head and looked directly into the void. The thunder and lightning dragon suddenly galloped towards Lin Yu again. In just a moment, the thunder and lightning dragon completely entangled Lin Yu. At this time, after Lin Yu was entangled by the thunder dragon, he felt a surge of power gathering in his body. In just this moment, Lin Yu's face suddenly turned ugly. After a moment, he felt a sweet sensation in his throat, and a mouthful of blood spurted out. At this time, the energy and blood all over his body was flowing backwards, and Lin Yu's face gradually became ugly. He could not help but shake his head slightly at that time. How is it possible? How could it be like this? At this time, Lin Yu seemed to hear a voice in the darkness. The voice came from a long distance and came to Lin Yu's side in just a moment. Little guy, I am the leader of 9 dragons. I show up today just to ask you, what do you want? Do you get us for the purpose of rising from the ground, or for the sake of the common people in this world? The dragon's voice was distant and vast, as if it had been crushed from the void. After hearing the dragon's voice, Lin Yu's eyes flashed with some complexity. At this time, he also glanced coldly at Zhuolong. None of that. Apparently, the Thunder Dragon was also a little stunned by Lin Yu's words. The Thunder Dragon's eyes were staring straight at Lin Yu, and at this moment, he suddenly laughed. Ha ha ha, it's interesting. You little guy is really interesting. Meeting me today is a bit unexpected. Then why don't you come and tell me what the Tao you follow is? It's very simple. In the world, evil people should be killed, and good people should be stood up. These 8 simple words were like pouring into the ears of this thunder and lightning dragon. At this time, after hearing these 8 words, the thunder dragon's eyes flashed with a bit of solemnity, and at this moment, he heard a low murmur in his mouth. Evil people should be killed, good people should be stood up. Evil people should be killed, good people should be stood up, good evil people should be killed, good people should be stood up. Today, I will accept you as my master, let's test your abilities for now. After the Thunder Dragon finished speaking, it suddenly poured into Lin Yu's sea of consciousness. At this moment, Lin Yu's sea of consciousness seemed to have suddenly split open. There were mountains, rivers, earth, flowers, and grass, there are winds, clouds, and rain, but there are only no creatures in this world. Although there are birds singing and flowers fragrant, they are lifeless. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chang. Chapter 185. A giant dragon hovered over a person in the 9 heavens. The person's face suddenly became so ugly. His eyes were pointed straight ahead, and he just looked over, with a bit of anger at the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. With a look of worry, he also sighed leisurely at this time. Alas, Kang Tian is dead, Huang Tian is here to stand, but now why is Kang Tian's 9 dragons now in the body of a little guy? What does the law of heaven mean by this? After the dragon master finished speaking, he turned around and glanced at the giant dragon beside him. After the dragon saw the dragon master's gaze, a few meaningful smiles appeared on the corners of his mouth. A bit of helplessness flashed in his eyes. Alas, misfortune lies where blessings depend, and blessings lie where misfortune lies. We are not able to explain the affairs of the world clearly, and this time you and we are completely unclear. After the giant dragon said this, he also sighed leisurely, and the corners of his eyes and brows were completely helpless. And just after this moment, the dragon controller seemed to remember something, and he looked towards the west. Bliss in the west. A giant Buddha stood like this on this spiritual mountain. In front of him, Buddhist believers knelt down one after another, their eyes full of reverence. That big Buddha, put your hands together and perform a Buddha salute. Amitabha, this time, the 9 heavens are changing. I'm afraid Huang Tian now will follow in the footsteps of Kang Tian back then. This time, he is really important and a bit unpredictable. Tathagata just turned his head towards Guanyin and glanced casually. Guanyin looked towards the lower realm like this. Perhaps the chess pieces that were buried back then should be used now. Otherwise, it would be somewhat unjustifiable to have spent so much effort to achieve such a game. Guanyin just said this unhurriedly. At this time, after hearing what Guanyin said, Tathagata nodded gently, with a bit of complexity flashing in his eyes, and a smile with deep meaning appeared at the corner of his mouth. It's true that it's a bit hard to explain, but if we keep doing nothing about these many things, I'm afraid. Of course Guanyin understood what Tathagata meant, so he suddenly smiled like this. Take it step by step. Anyway, we don't need to come forward. Someone from Tianfo Temple will naturally take action. This little guy's Taoist heart is unstable. The strange beast under his command, the dragon spirit, seems to have hidden agendas, so we don't need to worry about it. In this matter, even if he ascends to the 9 heavens, we can still kill him. Guanyin spoke unhurriedly. Tathagata nodded with satisfaction, and then waved his hand gently. That's right, that's very good. If that's the case, then do as you say. After a while, you will give some benefits to those in the lower world, but you must cut off the cause and effect, and never do anything that is contaminated by the cause and effect. It can't have anything to do with us. Tathagata said in a cold voice. His eyes were quite cold, and the murderous intention on his body was looming, and it was revealed like this. It was obvious that he had murderous intentions towards Lin Yu. After all, if this century-old plan was destroyed by Lin Yu, in one person's hands, it would probably end in a situation beyond redemption. And just a moment later, Tathagata seemed to suddenly remember something, and a strange light flashed in his eyes. At this moment, Lin Yu could only feel the surging power in his body, making everyone feel panic. At this time, he felt as if his body had exploded. And above the void, the royal family member suddenly opened his eyes. A general holding a sword and wearing armor suddenly took a step forward, and then suddenly appeared. Above this void. At this time, this space was filled with one person's laughter. Ha ha ha, it's interesting. It's the first time in such a long time that I think a person can be so interesting. The man was holding a long knife, and a bit of cold murderous intent flashed in his eyes, and it was even more vaguely revealed. This person was wearing armor, and the golden light seemed to make people feel frightened. That kind of frightened feeling gradually became more and more obvious. And just after this moment, a figure suddenly flashed out. The figure's speed was extremely fast. In just a moment, it rushed in front of a person. This person was wearing a Taoist robe, holding a fukin in his hand, and a long sword at his waist. Infinite Heavenly Lord. At this moment, everyone heard a Sanskrit sound. Amitba, good, good. Immediately after the Sanskrit sound, I saw a man wearing cassock. The man walked out slowly. There was a scar on his head, but his words were quite majestic. At this time, Lin Yu's eyes were staring straight at everything in front of him, and there seemed to be some kind of color surging in his eyes. In an instant, Lin Yu spurted out a mouthful of blood. At this time, the blood in Lin Yu's mouth was different from that of ordinary people. It turned out that the blood that spurted out of his mouth was actually a light golden color. Everyone's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, and their eyes were full of disbelief, especially the Buddhist man, who shook his head desperately. Impossible, this is absolutely impossible. How could this little guy be the reincarnation of the Buddhist? I must have seen it wrong, I must have seen it wrong. That day, Fu Luhan shook his head and waved his hands frantically. His eyes were full of helplessness, but at this moment even he had to admit that Lin Yu's current appearance made him feel a little scared. And just after this moment, Lin Yu seemed to remember something, and a faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. The old beggar turned his head subconsciously and looked at Lin Yu. His eyes were quite complicated, his eyes and eyebrows were full of helplessness, and his mouth also curled up a bitter smile. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji-Sheng Chang. Chapter 186. Little guy, if these old guys take action, my old bones won't last long, so you'd better take your time and fuse your divine body quickly before my old guy's bones fall apart. Senior, don't worry, juniors have their own sense of propriety, these people won't be able to keep up for long. Lin Yu just spoke to the old man calmly. After the old beggar heard Lin Yu's words, a bit of disbelief flashed in his eyes. He subconsciously turned his head and glanced at Lin Yu, and then raised his eyebrows slightly. Looking at your appearance, you must be in good condition. But after the old beggar said this, Lin Yu stopped talking. The old beggar just sighed heavily, with a bit of helplessness in his eyes, and a bitter smile at the corner of his mouth. Alas, I am an old man, and I still have to fight to the death like this. There is no other way. I am afraid that now I can only fight to the death. General Tianlong is holding a long sword, Burning Blood Ancient Buddha is holding a ring bead like this, Master Yuding is holding the Dragon Soul sword like this, these people are standing opposite each other, their eyes are like this, staring at each other, his eyes were full of cold murderous intent. Just a moment later, a figure suddenly shot up from a distance. Just a moment later, the figure came to the side. Almost during this breath, everyone's eyes were staring directly at the person who had just dodged past. Old beggar, you said you were in good health, why did you come to this muddy water? Now, wouldn't it be good to find a place to live and work in peace and enjoy your old age? Now you want to make things like this. The man's voice was quite sharp. In just a moment, the old beggar came to General Tianlong's side. My old bones are useless, but this little guy is very important to the world, so it doesn't matter if the old beggar dies, but the little guy can't die. After everyone heard what the old beggar said, they all turned their heads at the same time, staring at the old beggar with their eyes fixed on him, and the corners of their eyes and eyebrows were full of mockery. At this time they just laughed suddenly. Ha ha ha, it's interesting. It's really interesting. Old beggar, it seems that you want to be our enemy today no matter what. Don't forget that there are only three major forces in this world, the Empire of 10,000 Beasts and the Heavenly Empire. There is a Buddhist temple and a Tiananmen. If you offend all of us at once, do you think you can end up with a good ending? General Tianlong said so coldly. After he finished speaking, he heard the Taoist speak slowly. Even if you don't think about yourself, you have to think about the people of the Supreme Immortal Section. If the Supreme Immortal Sect is really destroyed, then you must be the culprit. And at this moment, the corner of the old beggar's mouth also evoked a bit of a sneer, and a bit of determination flashed in his eyes. At this moment, he seemed to be determined by something, staring straight ahead. A bit of murderous intent was revealed on his body. No matter what, I won't let you hurt this little guy this time, old beggar, keep your word and do what you say. At this time, after hearing what the old beggar said, all the people's faces suddenly became ugly. At this time, they showed a bit of murderous intent, and a cold momentum began. Gradually spread. Just a moment later, the old beggar seemed to suddenly remember something. At this time, a bit of coldness flashed in the old beggar's eyes, and a sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth. Interesting, it's really interesting. I really don't understand what kind of benefits this little guy has given you to make you work so hard for him. But even so, old beggar, don't blame me for being rude to you. But just after this moment, the old beggar seemed to suddenly remember something. At this time, his eyes were staring straight at General Tianlong, and something flashed in his eyes. The cold light on his body showed the murderous intention without any reservation. "General, there is something I don't know whether to say or not." General Tianlong heard this. After the old beggar said this, a cold light flashed in his eyes, and a murderous intention in his body was revealed. "What are you talking about? If you want to say something to sow discord, forget it. It's meaningless and I don't want to hear it. If it's something else, it doesn't hurt to talk about it." The old beggar heard this. After General Tianlong said this, there was a bit of a joking smile on the corner of his mouth, and a trace of amusement flashed in his eyes. "Actually, it's very simple. I just want to tell you that the 9 heavens on this cliff, the 3 realms and the 6 realms, will all be happy together." At this time, General Tianlong heard what the old beggar said, and his eyes were quite complicated. At this time, the old beggar seemed to have remembered something. Those who live in high places and have great achievements will inevitably end up with a good end in the end. If there is no one behind him, how could this little guy end up like this? There always has to be a scapegoat. After the old beggar finished speaking, he stared at them. At this time, they looked at each other, you look at me, I look at you, with a bit of complexity in their eyes. However, at this moment, they actually stayed where they were, not daring to act recklessly. After the old beggar saw this scene, a kind of joy emerged from the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. At this time, the old beggar just glanced at everyone. After waiting for this moment, it was only a moment, and these people suddenly felt that they suddenly burst out with a cold murderous intent. When they reached this level, they could have used the power of the strange beast long ago, and they didn't find this hand back. After all, they and the strange beasts in their bodies were extremely powerful, and they couldn't drive them at will. Sometimes they want to drive these strange beasts to pay a little price, and these prices are probably not easy for them to bear, so they can only resort to this last resort. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Chang. Chapter 187. The old beggar's eyes were staring straight at the people in front of him, with a bit of cold murderous intention in his eyes. At this moment, General Tianlong suddenly pulled out the Tianlong blood blade from his waist, and he slashed directly at the old beggar. And at this moment, everyone saw a surging killing intent. That surging killing intent shrouded everyone's hearts, allowing these people to see the horror of these guys. After the old beggar saw this scene, his face condensed slightly, and a bit of coldness flashed in his eyes. At this moment, the old beggar also took a deep breath, calmed down his mood a little, and then rushed straight up, reaching the top of the sky in one leap. At this time, his speed was extremely fast, and then a dark green long stick suddenly appeared in his hand. The dark green long stick was engraved with unicorn patterns. After General Tianlong saw the emerald spiritual stick in the old beggar's hand, his eyes showed a bit of solemnity. At this moment, his eyes were fixed on the old beggar's body, and his voice became even louder. It was even more cold and stern before. "Old guy, if I remember correctly, this stick in your hand should have been in the treasury of my 10,000 beasts empire, but why is it in your hands now?" Of course the old beggar is not a fool. Of course he will not tell General Tianlong about that matter directly. After all, the emperor is also a person who needs face. If outsiders know that he has saved him before, it actually doesn't matter. But if outsiders knew how embarrassed he was before, then the old beggar would definitely die. So at this time, the old beggar just smiled and waved his hands. He turned his head and looked towards General Tianlong. He only glanced slightly, and there were a few meaningful colors flashing in his eyes. Between his eyebrows, it seems a bit strange. And just after this moment, General Tianlong seemed to suddenly remember something, and then he shook his head. "No, there's definitely something wrong with you, old guy. This treasure was originally taken away by His Majesty, but now it's in your hands. What's going on?" The old beggar heard this. After General Tianlong said this, his eyes were full of helplessness. At this time, a bitter smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, and then he shook his head. I really don't know how you got the position of general. How can you, a mere general, handle the many matters of His Majesty the Emperor? The old beggar said coldly. His words can be regarded as awakening the dreamer. After General Tianlong heard what the old beggar said, his face was suddenly startled, and then he felt like he was enlightened. At this time, a layer of cold sweat broke out on General Tianlong's forehead. Of course, General Tianlong understood that the old beggar was actually trying to save himself. If he had continued to ask like this, he might have been killed. So at this time, General Tianlong also nodded slightly, with a bitter smile on the corner of his mouth, and a hint of helplessness flashed in his eyes. I see, I understand, thank you sir for your advice. At this time, after listening to the conversation between the two, Master Yuding just shook his head and smiled, with a bit of teasing and amusement in his eyes. It's interesting, it's really interesting. The majestic general of a foreign country actually lives without an old beggar. I understand, this really makes me wait. It's an eye-opener. General Tianlong just turned his head and looked at Master Yuding coldly. As early as 100 years ago, General Tianlong once fought against Master Yuding, but that time he defeated Master Yuding. Real person. In fact, it was originally just a private fight between the two, but this time the fight was rumored by someone, and Master Yuding lost his face. He always felt that it was General Tianlong who let this news out, so he always held a grudge against General Tianlong. Therefore, Master Yuding deliberately made trouble many times, but General Tianlong laughed it off in most cases. But later on, Master Yuding became more aggressive, and General Tianlong had no choice but to fight him forcefully. After General Tianlong thought of this, he couldn't help but shake his head. He just turned his head and glanced coldly at Master Yuding, with a bit of contempt in his eyes. For a small-minded person like you, if it hadn't been for this mission assigned by the Lord, I would never have joined forces with you. Master Yuding just pulled out the jade dragon sword from his waist. His eyes were fixed on General Tianlong, and a killing intent suddenly rushed out of his body. What on earth do you mean? Do you look down on me? In that case, it's better for us to show off and see who is stronger this time in front of everyone in the world. At this time, everyone just listened to Amitabha, and then one person slowly walked out. Amitabha, it's good, it's good. This little guy's divine body is about to be completed. If his divine body is completed, I'm afraid we won't have half a chance of winning. So right now, I think it's more important to deal with the person in front of me. At least it's much better than the internal strife we have here. The burning blood ancient Buddha spoke softly like this, and at this time, General Tianlong and Master Yuding glanced at Lin Yu, and found that Lin Yu was shining with colorful light at this moment, and it seemed that he was about to be completely destroyed. Done. So at this time, Master Yuding and General Tianlong just glared fiercely at each other. Old guy, let's just ride on the donkey and read the songbook. We'll wait and see who is more powerful. After Master Yuding and General Tianlong finished speaking, they suddenly jumped up, and then they showed their weapons. The old beggar just glanced at ancient Rangsu Buddha, with a bit of coldness flashing in his eyes. Asshole, it seems that the old beggar is still going to take action, but it doesn't hurt to come, just in time to give you a try. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 188. At this time, after the old beggar finished speaking, he suddenly jumped out. His speed was extremely fast. In just a moment, he had already arrived in front of a person. Then, the old beggar suddenly waved himself. In his hand is the jade spiritual stick. Then, he used a force to split Huashan Mountain and suddenly jumped out towards General Tianlong. Just between breathing and breathing, Just in this brief moment, the old beggar seemed to suddenly understand something. His face suddenly sank, and a trace of consciousness suddenly emerged in his heart. With an ominous premonition, cold sweat was pouring from his forehead at this time. Just a moment later, the Tianlong blood blade in General Tianlong's hand suddenly swung up and struck the old beggar suddenly. This day, the heavenly dragon blood blade flashed a cold light in the void, and the cold breeze shone, giving people a natural sense of oppression. The few people around him had no intention of taking action at this time. General Tianlong certainly knew that intrigues between major forces were commonplace. These guys just want to hide away secretly and watch themselves make a fool of themselves and watch their own show. So at this time, General Tianlong let out an angry roar, and a cold look flashed in his eyes. What are you bastards doing here to watch the excitement? If you don't come over quickly to help, what are you waiting for? General Tianlong let out a low roar, and the coldness in his eyes began to become more and more obvious, and there was even more murderous intent in his body. And just after this moment, the corners of the mouths of the group of people evoked a faint smile, and their eyes were fixed on General Tianlong, their eyes full of amusement and mockery. I originally thought you might have some abilities, but now it seems like nothing more than that. It's not worth mentioning at all, let alone nothing to fear. General Tianlong said in a deep voice. Of course the old beggar understood that General Tianlong was just deliberately irritating him, but at this time, the cold murderous intent in his eyes still began to become more and more obvious. If you want to anger me, fine, you succeeded, but even so, there is one thing I want you to understand. After General Tianlong heard what the old beggar said, he narrowed his eyes and then glanced at the old beggar. What happened? You have to understand that if I kill you, they will not save you. On the contrary, they will wait for me to kill you and then kill me at the same time. So your death will be in vain. The old beggar spoke unhurriedly, his eyes staring directly at General Tianlong, quite a bit of teasing and amusement. At this time, after General Tianlong heard what the old beggar said, his face suddenly sank, and his eyes became somewhat solemn. His eyes were fixed on the old beggar. There seemed to be a bit of complexity flashing through his eyes, and finally his brows tightened together. At this time, General Tianlong seemed to suddenly remember something. He turned his head and glanced coldly at the old beggar, with a flash of coldness in his eyes. There was so much murderous intent on his body. In just this breath, just in this brief moment, General Tianlong and the old beggar were fighting together. The two were fighting so hard that they were inseparable and inseparable. And just after this moment, the old beggar suddenly turned around, and then suddenly kicked General Tianlong's chest so hard. General Tianlong just took several steps back and then managed to stabilize his body. At this time, he only felt a surge in his chest, and then he turned his head and stared at the old beggar. At this time, General Tianlong showed a bit of murderous intent. Just in this moment, General Tianlong seemed to have remembered something. He gently wiped the corner of his mouth. With that trace of red blood, he turned his head and glared at the old beggar fiercely. At this time, the old beggar also glanced at General Tianlong, with a bit of coldness flashing in his eyes, and the murderous intention on his body was even more looming. The two people looked at each other, and it was just a moment. The old beggar suddenly came forward again, came to the side of General Tianlong, and then kicked General Tianlong. At this moment, General Tianlong moved towards the back one after another. Took several steps back, and finally managed to stabilize his body. General Tianlong turned his head and glared coldly at the two of them. The murderous intent on his body loomed out like this, and a cold aura spread. Come on, that cold aura made everyone feel a bit of fear in their hearts. At this time, Master Jade Ding and Ancient Buddha Ran Deng looked at each other, with a faint smile on their lips, and a hint of amusement flashed in their eyes. Do you think we should take action now? According to the current situation, if it continues like this, I'm afraid Tianlong will die in the hands of this old beggar. After hearing what Jade Ding said, the ancient Buddha Ran Deng flashed a bit of amusement in his eyes, and a meaningful smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, and then he shook his head. In my opinion, it's not necessary. At this time, after hearing what the ancient Buddha Ran Deng said, Jade Ding turned his head and looked at him, a few meaningful lights flashed in his eyes, and then his brows frowned directly. No need? Are you sure? The ancient Buddha Ran Deng nodded gently. Anyway, this man was killed by the old beggar. When we go to trouble, we will go to the Supreme Immortal section. What does trouble have to do with us? What do you think? After hearing what the ancient Buddha Ran Deng said, the smile in the eyes of Jade Ding Genren began to become more and more obvious, and then he nodded gently. That's true. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 189. General Tianlong was beaten back by the old beggar. At last, he managed to stabilize his body. At this time, he stared at the old beggar with a cold look in his eyes. At this time, a voice came to Lin Yu's sea of consciousness. The voice was far and vast, coming from far away. Gradually, he suddenly heard an elegant female voice from the system. When he heard that elegant voice, his eyes were full of excitement. Ding, congratulations to the host. The system upgrade is complete and enters the 2.0 era. The reward to the host is the primitive posture. Please check it out. Lin Yu's eyes were quite excited. At this time, he smiled with excitement in his eyes. The smile at the corner of his mouth began to become more and more obvious. System 2.0, really good. Lin Yu's eyes were quite playful. At this moment, Lin Yu saw that in his mind, rows of dazzling goods suddenly appeared. In fact, compared with before, Lin Yu found that the types of items now seemed to be a little less. In today's stores, there are exotic beast eggs, elixirs, and magic weapons, which are only divided into these three categories. As for magic weapons, they are available, but the points required for redemption are a huge number. After seeing this scene, Lin Yu's eyes flashed with a special brilliance, and his eyes were full of excitement. At this time, his eyes and eyebrows all revealed a kind of joy. Lin Yu's eyes were slightly closed, and a few special colors flashed in his eyes. If that's the case, then these exotic beasts in the future, I'm afraid. When Lin Yu thought of this, he suddenly remembered to go and see some of these exotic beast eggs from the ancient wilderness. Lin Yu didn't know until he saw it, and he was really shocked when he saw it. At this time, when Lin Yu saw the points required to lay the beast eggs, he also took a breath of cold air. Why does this require so many points? Basically, the cheapest prehistoric beast egg requires hundreds of millions of points. These points, the beast eggs exchanged, are all extremely talented, and this can basically be said to be an encyclopedia of Shanhaijing. When Lin Yu saw the dazzling array of beast eggs, his eyes were full of excitement. At this time, his excitement was simply beyond words. And at this time, Lin Yu seemed to suddenly remember something, and at this time he suddenly felt a burst of clarity in his mind. The host's life is detected to be abnormal and may be threatened. The system upgrades to automatically protect the host. There are only 3 chances. Do you want to activate the first chance? All the people outside looked at Lin Yu, as if he was a balloon that was about to be burst. At this time, their eyes flashed with different colors, and then their brows frowned together. What's going on? This little guy is in so much pain, it seems like he's about to collapse. It seems that we don't need to think about how to kill this little guy if we stand up. It looks like he will die here in a short time. This is the best way. Yes, in fact, this little guy is quite likable. If he is killed like this, it would be a pity. But there is no other way. He has affected the interests of too many people. If I don't kill him, I will feel uneasy. What you said is true. If this little guy doesn't die, I can't justify it. It seems that the guy is about to collapse. If we do this thing too drastically, it will be a bit unreasonable. Maybe he will come to trouble us at that time. So in my opinion, it is better to cut the Gordian knot and kill this little guy and the old guy first. After the man finished speaking, he glanced at Uding Genren. After hearing what the burning blood ancient Buddha said, Uding Genren's eyes flashed with a bit of complexity. The two sides suddenly fought again. The two people fought hard and hard. There was a burst of swords and swords around. In the swords and swords, everyone felt a huge pressure. At this moment, Lin Yu's body swelled up like this, and gradually seemed to stop. At this time, Lin Yu's eyes flashed with excitement, and he was naturally very happy in his heart. Although it was a pity to use the body armor once, under the current situation, if he did not use it, he would surely die. Jade Ding Genren and Burning Blood Ancient Buddha looked at each other with a cold light in their eyes. After being kicked away by the old beggar, General Tianlong retreated for a long time before he managed to stabilize his body. He gently wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth, and at this time, he stared at the old beggar. "Asshole, you are just looking for death." At this time, the old beggar had a cold smile on his face, and his eyes seemed to flash with a cold light. "Now it seems that you are doomed to die. They seem to have given up on you. Maybe they will attack me after you die, but all this is not important. What do you think?" The old beggar's eyes were fixed on General Tianlong, and General Tianlong was naturally very angry after hearing what the old beggar said. His eyes were fixed on the old beggar, and the cold murderous intent was revealed. Then, just a moment later, a figure suddenly rushed up. The man was very fast. In just one breath, he had arrived in front of the old beggar. Who else could this be but Jade Ding Genren? Jade Ding Genren glanced coldly at the burning blood ancient Buddha and General Tianlong and said, "The current situation does not allow us to say anything else. Let's start and cut the Gordian knot. Maybe we can kill this guy. If we are late, I am afraid it will be too late to regret." Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 190. After Master Yuding said this, they instantly understood what Master Yuding meant. At this time, they looked at each other, and there seemed to be a flash of coldness in their eyes. "Okay, let's summon the beasts together at the same time, and kill them with one blow. Kill them first." After Master Yuding finished speaking, he suddenly rushed out. In just one breath, in just a moment, he stood in the void. At this time, Lin Yu's brain was blank. Lin Yu began to carefully recall that he seemed to have some points before, but for some reason, he looked at his points panel and it was empty. A beautiful woman suddenly appeared in front of Lin Yu and landed in front of Lin Yu. Lin Yu glanced at the beauty, and his eyes seemed to be quite complicated. "Who are you?" The beauty just smiled charmingly at Lin Yu. "I am the elf of the system, you can call me Arya. I can answer some of your doubts." The elf was wearing quite hot clothes, just covering some important parts. Lin Yu glanced at the elf, and a faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. "Tell me, what happened to my points?" "Reporting to the master, because of the system upgrade, your previous points were cleared, but..." At this time, Arya looked embarrassed. After hearing what Arya said, Lin Yu was quite angry at first, but he came back to his senses after a moment. "But what? Is there some compensation or something like that?" Arya nodded gently. "You can be rewarded with a random prehistoric beast egg, but as for what you can get, it will probably depend on you at that time. You should know that these prehistoric beast eggs are very valuable, and they are all the beasts from the ancient prehistoric times in the classic of mountains and seas. These ancient beasts from the prehistoric times are naturally not to be underestimated, and their levels may have already entered the legendary epic realm. Lin Yu nodded gently, but I have a lot of points, these things alone don't seem to be enough. Lin Yu said slowly, and a faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. At this time, he was like a profiteer, staring at Arya with his eyes. Arya's eyes flashed with helplessness, and a bitter smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Then please tell me what you want. Whatever you want, I will definitely agree to it. Arya's voice became smaller and smaller, while Lin Yu's smile became thicker and thicker. At this time, he coughed softly. Ahem, actually, it's not a big deal. I think those magic weapons are good. Can they also? Arya's face was a little helpless. At this time, the bitter smile on her mouth became more and more obvious. There is really no way to get those weapons from the arsenal again, but there is a special weapon. The previous owner exchanged it, but never used it, and never sealed it again. I can give it to you. After hearing what Arya said, Lin Yu's eyes were obviously a little excited. At this time, he stared at Arya. Hurry up and take out that weapon. After all, none of the things in the arsenal are ordinary items, so Lin Yu naturally believes that what Arya takes out this time will definitely not be ordinary. At this moment, Master Yu Ding suddenly summoned the three-legged two-winged beast. This three-legged two-winged beast has 3 legs and 2 pairs of wings on its back. Exotic beasts, 3 groups of 2 exotic beasts at the epic level 8, level 49. Qualification, exotic, intermediate. Life, 9999999977777. Speed, 9999999977777. Defense, 9999999977777. Attack, 9999999977777. Skills, instantaneous movement, 10,000 arrows, 10,000 rain piercing the heart, tearing. Instantaneous movement, the three-legged two-winged beast activates a skill, moving behind a person in the blink of an eye, and shuttles through time and space, but this time and space is forcibly split. 10,000 arrows, the three-legged two-winged beast activates a skill, in an instant, violently uses all methods, uses spiritual power as a sword, tramples everything, and destroys the world. 10,000 rain piercing the heart, the three-legged two-winged beast activates a skill, violently uses all methods, and can control rain and turn it into a force that can attack the souls of others. Soul tearing, the three-legged two-winged beast can tear the soul of others with its powerful skills, but it can only be used when the enemy is weak or dizzy. At this time, General Tianlong also suddenly made a hand gesture, and at this time, a Tianlong hunting horse suddenly appeared under his crotch. This Tianlong hunting horse has 2 wings on its back, and its whole body is red. The flames around this Tianlong hunting horse seem to want to completely burn the surrounding air, which is very terrifying. Everyone was surprised. Exotic beast, Dragon Hunter Epic Level 6, Level 49. Qualification, Alien, Intermediate. Life, 9999999977777. Speed, 9999999977777. Defense, 9999999977777. Attack, 9999999977777. Skills, 10,000 horses galloping, 10,000 horses silent, transformation into dragon. 10,000 horses galloping, Dragon Hunter activates a skill, 10,000 dragon horses galloping at the same time, with the potential to break people's hearts and destroy all laws of heaven and earth. 10,000 horses silent, Dragon Hunter activates a skill, 10,000 horses wailing at the same time, which can make people lose their minds for a short time, can infect people with a negative emotion, can disturb other people's minds, and those who are not good at cultivation and have a weak heart of Tao can go crazy with just one move. Transformation into a dragon, the dragon hunter horse activates a skill. The dragon hunter horse has the blood of the dragon clan, so it can transform into a dragon. It can use one or two of the dragon's methods to strengthen its own body, making it invulnerable to swords and guns, and immune to water and fire. Its body is comparable to a heavenly spiritual weapon.